Well, thank you, Kathy, for the chance here. This next subject is going to be new equipment that's new on the market, things you might want to look at and think about trying. In the meanwhile, you can also pick up this new booklet that Pride has put out. This is about equipment that's more familiar to you probably. It's all the old stuff that we've been using for years. If you think back, maybe some of your first runs you ever did with dogs, think about all the things you learned by trial and error. What we're trying to do here is relieve some of those, possible accidents that I think have happened to everybody. One of the memorable ones for me, when I first started making gangline, I thought that that hollow rope was sort of like the old Chinese handcuffs. You'd get your fingers in there and get them stuck. So you make some gangline and just weave it right through itself. Well, of course, the first time I ran with that, the whole thing came apart. So we've got lots of suggestions for things like that could happen to you. If you want to pick this up, if you're a member of Pride, you get a free copy. They're upstairs at our table. And then if you want to join the group, I'd urge you to do that. You get this booklet plus the care guidelines that we came out with a couple years ago. So I invite you to do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. I don't know if a lot of you are like me, but if you don't want to be on the receiving end of this information, you have friends that need it. And it's been absolutely wonderful for me the last few years to have the Pride guidelines to hand to people who say, well, tell me about mushing dogs, or what do I need to know to get started? And instead of me sitting there time after time starting from scratch, I could say, here, read this book, come back to me and ask me some questions. And I think this equipment guideline is going to provide the same kind of service. I'll be honest, I wasn't really terribly enthusiastic when the project started. I wasn't sure that it was needed. And I've been absolutely amazed at the quality of information in there and how useful it is to me as well as to people just getting started. With that, I'll introduce our two speakers today. I think both of them are known to most people. Jeff King is been running dogs for about 17 years now. He started off winning the Yukon Quest and has since won the Iditarod twice. Also won the Cobuck 440 and probably just about every other major race he's competed in. Jacques Philippe is from France, now living halfway between Fairbanks and Nenana. Jacques is a three-time champion of the Alparod stage race in Europe. Jacques has also competed in the Iditarod several times. He too is a winner of the Cobuck 440. He's competed in the Open North American sprint races. And as I said to Jacques, his wife Magali keeps him tuned up on sprint issues if he gets too concerned about the middle distance sorts of equipment and gear. I think the thing both Jacques and Jeff have in common is that they both pay a lot of attention to detail, and they're trying to provide absolutely the best care and equipment as well as training for their dogs. And we thought it would be really useful for some of you today to hear about some of the newer things in equipment. Sometimes you go to the store and you see what's sort of off-the-shelf technology, but you don't hear about any of these leading-edge things or the new experimentation that's going on with some of the top drivers. And this was a chance for you to ask them questions about some of these things. So I think we'll hear about some of the basics as well as some of these newer kinds of things. What we thought might be a reasonable approach is we basically have a list of different sorts of equipment that we all use on a daily basis, and let either or both of the guys talk about them if they feel they have something different to contribute. And I guess maybe the most basic place to start is sleds. What kind of sleds do you use? What determines your choice of a sled? What do you think is important about a sled?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that we're going to present a few things that we know. Obviously, there are many other things that are new that we don't know, so if some of you have any new equipment that you want to speak about too, you can later, because I think it's important for everybody to know about these new equipments that we may not be aware of. For the sleds, I'm going to show you a few pictures, a few transparencies about some of the latest sled technology, specifically in runners. After, I can show you one of the runners that's been designed with the latest technology. this is not going to be a full presentation about sleds. There will be another specific presentation tomorrow, maybe more oriented towards the maneuverability of the sled and the driving. I'm just going to talk about a few basics of the conception of the structure of the sleds, where some advances have been made. One of the points that you can see on this, the difference between the cross-country ski and the alpine ski. Can you hear without the microphone? No? So basically one of the main differences between cross-country ski and alpine ski is the shape of the ski in the length. That means you can have parallel sides to a ski like the cross-country skis or a wasp waist side. And in the turning ability, this is going to make a big difference. In the cross-country ski, the technique that's been used is a step-by-step turning. In the alpine ski, you can see the technique is just sliding, using the curve of the ski itself when you bend it to turn. And this is one of the new points in the technology. You can find now some runners, ski runners, that have this shape and improve the turning ability. Okay, so that's all for this one. Now I'm going to show you the structure. This happens to be the structure of an extra-pole runner, but this is used also by some other sleds, like the OT sled, I think, has about the same structure, because this is the structure that's being used in most of the modern skis, especially the cross-country skis. Basically, the idea is that you have a core, and here the core is this part here, the foam, it's foam, and it's used mostly as a filler to give a shape to the runner. The most important part probably of the sled is the fibers, because the fibers is what is going to give the runner its strength and also its behavior. In that particular case, the fibers are of three kinds, but in two different layers. The fiberglass is inside, and on the outside of the fiberglass you have Kevlar and carbon fiber. The fiberglass property is strength, like I said, but also it's a lot more flexible than Kevlar and carbon fiber. So if you were to put only one of those components, let's say Kevlar, for instance, and carbon fiber, your runner would be too stiff. If you put only fiberglass, it would be too flexible. That's why these people combine both. The wood, you see there's a layer of wood also on the top and on the bottom, and the role of the wood is really not structural. It's only to hold the screws that are going to attach the rail to put the runners under, and also the brackets on top that hold the stanchions. If you compare it to the structure of skis, the skis, instead of that wood, the skis will use pieces of metal, little pieces of metal. And the reason why they don't use pieces of metals in the sled is that they have to put so many screws alongside, especially for the QCR, that when they put it in a mold, because this is all pressed and compressed in epoxy at a warm, hot temperature, and the differences in temperature on such a long piece of metal would make a dilatation that would impair the whole ski. So that's why they use wood, and the wood is just there to hold the screws one more time. So this is not a complete explanation of the ski, but people that are really interested, there will be a specific panel tomorrow about that. Another point about the sleds, and this is kind of an illustration, is the use of composite material. What is called composite material, actually I think the runners could be called a composite material, is basically the idea is to use fiber and mix it with some kind of resin, some kind of epoxy, and give it a shape and mold all that, not mold, but I mean shape all that together. And that's what this sled how this sled had been designed. One of the problems with this composite material is that it doesn't resist very well to shocks. And as you know, lots of times on a sled, you may hit the sled with a snow hook or any object, hit a tree or anything. And so far, the resistance of this material has not been very good. So that's one of the reasons why it's not used that much. Another reason is the price. It's very expensive because there's a lot of labor involved in this. Everything has to be done by hand and has to be sanded several times and varnished again and sanded. So that's a limiting factor. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the stanchion of the new OT sleds now are made of composite material, and I couldn't say, how that reacts. But this gives you an idea of how the sleds in the future may look, but there is still some improvement. Lots of people still prefer aluminum or wood for stanchions. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about sleds. There will be a specific panel, so.
Jeff, do top Iditarod teams use something that high-tech, or what do you think is important to tell people about a sled?
Well, strikes me as probably one of the biggest contrasts between the different types of mushing, how suitable something like that would be for that place and a short track that's been groomed. Probably the number one prerequisite I want to have for the sleds I'll take in a distance race, especially something like the Iditarod or the Quest, is durability and my ability to fix it if it does break. Number one, I want something that won't break or is least likely to break, and yet if it does, that I'm capable of fixing it. And the single thing that I've seen that's been the biggest impact to me and my sleds, and the sleds that I've driven the last several years, have been Tim White's aluminum runner. They come in a couple different weights. All the sleds I've built, and I have built my own sleds, with the exception of the finishing sled I used in this year's Iditarod, I've built these sleds with Tim White's aluminum runners. I think starting from there, you can't go wrong. I have no interest at all in his interests or his runners, except that they've worked, I've seen, and had just remarkable stories. I'm not much of a craftsman, and yet even I built an incredibly well-suited sled for the Iditarod that, in fact, I've had one that has been in 2 years of Anchorage to Nome. I'm quite sure I was one of the first people to ever drive the same sled all the way from Anchorage to Nome in a competitive team. And not only did that save me expense on the trail, but tremendous versatility along the trail. I don't have my sled here to show, but I think starting with those aluminum runners, you can't go wrong. They are that with a plastic nose. We were able to build in some of the best points about the toboggan sled, the durability of a toboggan sled. When I first started mushing, certainly the number one, well, there's several places on our wooden sleds that seemed to continually break. It was the nose piece right behind the brush bow and the nose piece. If the brush bow was wood, it broke, and if the nose piece was wood, then it was next to go. And inevitably, in fact, in my first 3 Yukon Quests, each year I brand new sleds built better and better each year. I broke the runner tails in 3 consecutive races, and I've had these aluminum runners under so much more stress, completely resilient to shock, and I know of only a couple of failures of the runners anywhere, and they only occurred after some very specific damage was done to the runner. So that and QCRs certainly just about old hat anymore in a distance team, the quick change runner system. But I'm really enjoy and want to keep the plastic rails, or something I don't think are common or near as common, but the aluminum runners will sport a plastic rail, and the manufacturer has made at sometimes even a plastic rail that can be screwed to a wood runner, much to replace the aluminum one. And I have had those also on a wooden runner. And I think the plastic rail is a huge advantage over the aluminum. The aluminum consistently seems to break at a screw hole. I've seen some people cut them into pieces and put them on in pieces to keep them from breaking. It requires a lot of screws, a lot of protrusion into the runner, and yet the plastic rails slide on inside the aluminum rail. So I'm pretty hot on them, and I can't foresee. In fact, I just recently purchased several sets of runners with no intention of even what's going to go on them. I just don't ever want to get caught without them. There's all kinds of unique ways to utilize them. I feel the sled I've been building the last few years is very inexpensive. Materials probably, even with a $300 set of runners, I don't think the total expenses for the sled come in much over $500 in parts, with $300 of it being the runner. And last year I was teased profusely and expect to be more, but as I mentioned, not being quite the craftsman many of my neighbors are and other dog mushers and sled builders are, and a hockey fan, it was when I noticed the hockey sticks getting broke so consistently. I knew the upper end of the stick never broke. Anyway, I got the fan club of the Nanooks to give me an armload of broken hockey sticks, and my current sleds under construction all have hockey stick pieces for stanchions. They're laminated wood, covered in fiberglass, resin, and fabric. They are stronger and lighter than any piece of wood I've ever seen or have ever been personally able to put together, not to mention incredibly accessible, uniform, already finished, and will probably be just about every wooden piece of any sled I make for a while.
So this is the ultimate in hockey recycling.
Right. However, the sled I chose to finish this year's Iditarod with, this is the first time I really left Anchorage not expecting to use this sled. However, I was very impressed with and after getting a sled made in Germany. My sled I finished the Iditarod with is up on the floor here after a year of training, and this year's finish of the Iditarod on it. Very light duty, extremely light and maneuverable, much closer composite wood and fiberglass laminated runners with aluminum stanchions. Some of the real advantages over the sled I built would be maneuverability. It's way more flexible, but I didn't want to have to fix it, and I don't want to put a team on an Iditarod trail, my 16 dogs I start the race with, on the kind of trail we're likely to get. It isn't durable enough to start the race with. You have to merit the equipment for the condition, but it is more maneuverable, much lighter, a tremendous braking system. It's made in Germany, and it's available out there to take a look at.
I think Jeff and Jacques have both made a good point, and that is that you have to really think about the kind of racing or mushing you're going to do before you pick your sled. Clearly, those of us who are sprint drivers fix our sleds at home in the comfort of a wood shop or our living rooms or our garages, and you guys who are out on a trail with 900 miles to go have to fix it on the spot, and it's going to make a big difference in how the sled's put together and what you want to try to fix out there.
Just one little point to mention is that those new materials and those new technologies are only possible if there is a certain amount of sleds that are being made, because lots of them are expensive to produce, and lots of times you have to have special pieces, special parts manufactured, and that's a very good example, because I think the runners the stanchions, that Jeff was using on his sleds, and the stanchions we have been using and that are being used in the French sleds have been designed in cooperation between those two sled factories. They went together to aluminum company, and they designed from the ground a special tube with specific constraints, and they gave all the specifics that have to be met for a sled, and they were able to design a stanchion that's better than wood, and that's better than a lot of other pieces. So that's a good, to me, that's a good point.
Jeff, you want to talk about tug lines, tow lines a little bit?
Well, I don't know how much I can say, except certainly I don't think I've run a tow line that didn't have cable in it, with the exception of that iron rope. I've kind of lost my enthusiasm for that as a racing, even for training. However, durable, I think there were some real drawbacks with that iron rope gang line. Durability is certainly its strength, but the weaknesses were its too slack, the potential for tangles, knots were difficult to untie, it absorbs water, and I don't think that that's the purpose, or the best purpose for that, for a tow line. The only thing unique, or I think reasonably unique or not commonplace about the tow line I have built for my teams, is that the gang line is really just rope, and the cable that's in it will never ever be tight unless the rope breaks. There's actually, if you could just imagine the cable strung inside the rope 2 inches longer than the rope itself when it's under tension. And that little loop of 2 inches of cable sticks out the side of my tug line on every section. When the dogs pull, the rope gets taut, and the only way the cable would ever hold anything is if the rope breaks. And that's the intention. I don't want to have the rigidity of a cable gang line. And it's a fail-safe. I know that if my rope ever breaks, the cable will hold, and it's time to replace the tug line. So I really don't expect the cable to ever hold more than the one time that occurs when it gets broken, or the rope gets chewed or frayed or for some reason breaks. So the only thing unique about my gang lines is the fact that they have cable in them, but the cable is not part of the physics until something breaks.
Mm-hmm. Jacques, what are you using for tow lines right now?
Well, it depends, but as far as some of the newest things, like Jeff mentioned, what is called iron rope is Spectra, and I'm not sure of the chemical composition, but I don't think people are too interested. I brought a sample for those people that might not know what it is, and like Jeff said, it's a lot more flexible than regular polyethylene line, and that's a problem. So to work around that problem, people have put either cable inside, or like this one, a little piece of plastic that doesn't give it any strength, because this rope has 100 times the strength of the polyethylene. So you don't really need anything for strength. But this gives it a little rigidity. This has some drawbacks, because this is not tied and sealed like the cables, and you see this is a good example. Eventually it will come out and you may have to cut it again. Also, you can see it does make it a little more rigid, but it's not 100% more rigid. On the other hand, like Jeff said, and especially at least for mid-distance people and sprint people, we are not so worried about the tug line soaking water, because you don't go through water usually in sprint races or mid-distance races, and that's a problem in long distance. But in sprint races, lots of times your dogs run pretty hot and sweat a lot from the tongue, and you get the neckline like a big chunk of ice, and that's a problem with these lines. And there's a way you can help that, at least partially, by using, I don't remember the exact name, but you can find some food-approved lubricant that you can spray. It's a spray, and it's used to lubricate machines that handle food. And you can lubricate the necklines with that, and you have to do it fairly often. So once again, that's not really suited for long-distance racing. But this way you can use this on necklines, and that's kind of enjoyable because the necklines are what the dogs are more likely to chew lots of times. So you can see on this one, for the tug lines, this material is not used, mostly because the dogs usually don't chew the tug lines as long as you have enough space between the dog's head and the tug line. So because this material is also more expensive than regular polyethylene, the normal rope is used, the nylon rope is used for this. So I guess that's it for these. If people want to take a look at them, they can after.
I actually, that was one of those sections of the new Pride equipment guidelines that I found particularly good, and if you guys pick them up, that they have good, complete discussions of tow lines and dimensions and different types of materials and the advantages and disadvantages.
Now, also, I can add specifically for sprint people, because in long distance and mid distance racing, it's been in the rules of the races that you have to put a cable in the line. So people are not so worried about the dogs chewing the tow line and having half of the thing take off, and that's a big hazard for the dogs. But in sprint racing, people have been really, at least some people, didn't want to put cable in the lines because it's heavier, or because they were never used to it. So I think this kind of rope is a really, really good help for sprint people, because they don't have the weight of the cable and still have a much bigger strength, and I think that's important.
A lot of us read Mushing Magazine earlier this year and saw an article on some of the new ideas in harness design. I know Bob Brooks was up here at our previous symposiums talking about some of the kinds of injuries he'd seen on long-distance races, and he thought that some of these injuries at least might be prevented by proper harness design, or at least different harness design than what some of us were using now. I know Jeff and Jacques have both been working with Karin Franzine on the development of slightly different harnesses. Jeff, you want to tell us a little bit about what you're using in harnesses now, whether you think it's significantly different or better, or where you'd like to see us go?
Well, I can tell you it's a lot different than where I started in my discussions with Karin. When I first went to her and we first talked, I had envisioned a harness completely different than the one I ended up using that she made. And we worked extensively on many, many different styles. In fact, literally dozens and dozens. And in the end, we didn't seem to be able to perfect or improve ideas she had already had. And the harness that I tested for her, along with Jacques, I believe, and liked enough to choose to run the latter half of training season and the entire Iditarod in, was her collared neck H-back harness. This is exactly like the ones I used. I think you could best tell how they're unique by handling one yourself at her booth, but I think the most significant thing is the size of the neck opening in addition to its construction. I know that when I first tried them, I didn't like, or I rebelled against the fact that they're more difficult to put on. But I think exactly the reason they're more difficult to put on is why they're superior to the dog. I looked at some of the old Tiger harnesses that I had that go on so much easier and I was more accustomed to. They rode on the dog way out on the, much further on the shoulders, and with every stride we could see the parts of the harness actually moving. And I think what I saw happening with this design was the harness, the places the harness is resting on the dog have some of the least movement, including and most importantly this little section directly behind the back of the neck, which is intended and adequately goes right between the shoulder blades. If you look at her old harnesses and many harnesses, just about any other harness I ever used, the dog is running, you actually can see the webbing going up and down with every stride. And this piece spans the two bones of the scapula and seems to reduce a spot where a moving part of the dog is no longer moving the harness. And you know, I'm certainly a believer in the lightweight materials. I've gotten, seems like, you know, I just a couple of years on a harness and I feel like I've gotten its life. I really don't like a heavy webbing harness, and I don't like heavy padding fabrics, you know, and I often realize just how hard I want my dogs to pull. Granted, we teach them to pull very hard, and they have the work ethic to pull very hard, but then I think one of the real arts, and it's not part of this topic, but one of the real challenges is having a hard-working, good ethic dog team and teach them when to pull and when not to pull. And the fact is there's not a lot of pulling going on, and certainly this much padding provides adequate protection for the degree of pulling that they need to do. You know, you see a big heavy weight pulling harness with wide straps and heavy padding, it's quite appropriate. The fact is I don't believe there's ever more than a very minimal amount of pull on the tug line on the average. I sure am a believer in the reflective tape too. I think it's a good idea.
Now, Jacques, you, I believe, use that collared neck and use it in an X-back form.
Yeah, I think probably, you know, and it's all a matter of personal preference, but at least mine is to use the X-back type a little, you know, preferably to the H-back for sprint and mid-distance racing. One of the major problems, not major, but one of the problems with the X-back before was that the rib cage, the cross, you know, and those pieces were coming to push, to give pressure against the rib cage. And adding this piece here on top, you know, not only released some of the pressure on the scapulas, but it also allowed these pieces to be a little more back. Now, there's a little downside to that. It's that this piece of webbing here is not holding the harness straight on the dog quite as much as before. So that's something you may have to watch a little more with this type of harness. And you know, some people have said that for a few specific dogs that have a rib cage with a certain shape, you know, the dog may be the harness, this type may be slipping a little more. So for certain dogs like that, you may want to switch back to the older type of harness, you know, for specific cases. But I think overall this is a great improvement too. The other point, I think, for sprint and mid-distance, personally, I like the Polar Fleece better than this foam type. I know for long distance the foam type is really a plus because of the wind and the blowing snow and the water, possible dogs going through water. But for mid and short distance, it seems the Polar Fleece gives a much better cushion, and we don't seem to see as much abrasion on the dogs with this type of padding.
I'm a little like Jeff. I have about half of my harnesses now are the collared necks, and when I first looked at them, I just sort of took harnesses for granted, and I basically fit them, and I got the new collared neck, and they were a pain in the neck to put on, plus the fact that I didn't pay attention when, mostly they were a pain in the neck to take off. And a large part of that was because I didn't bother to pay attention when Karin showed me how to flip the harness inside out and pull it off the easy way. But the more I watch my dogs run in them, the more noticeable the difference is between the two. And I find myself going to those in the bundle now because the fit is so tidy. It just is a really nice fit around the shoulders. I want to hear you guys talk about booties. Sprint mushers aren't necessarily very discriminating about booties, but believe it or not, we do use them. And last year when I was around some of my distance friends, I saw some of the most high-tech, fancy fabric booties I'd ever seen. They weren't just the polar fleece bunning booties that live in the back of my truck. Jeff, do you use those, or Jock, do you use them? And talk about booties a little bit.
Well, I think same with harnesses. I mean, Karen's made a product I'm thrilled with. It, really her effort and energy, her whole life is dedicated to that. I wanted to find somebody whose life was dedicated to booties. I don't want to be the one doing the research. I have enough to do to just train my dog team. So when it comes to many of the things I'm going to share with you, I want to find somebody else whose goals and interests are specifically those areas and use those strengths, try them out, and not necessarily do what I can to help make them better, but more in a level of testing. But anyway, the booty fiasco of '95 is well remembered by all of Iditarod, and certainly tremendous strides have been made with booties that were on the market that year. The main things I think that were the advantages was the paper-thin fabrics that have been discovered that would have the durability of a much heavier. What we want is a booty that won't wear out, but be as thin and paper-like as possible. Maybe not paper isn't a good word, but my goal is to have, I realized that dogs were slipping. There was more potential for injury with booties on than there were from a hurt foot from having a booty, not having a booty on. What I wanted to have was a booty that gave the dog the benefits that our previous booties had, but didn't reduce their traction so dramatically. And when Swingley's found this fabric that seemed to offer that, I can remember testing those booties and seeing the entire footprint of my dog after 70 miles, just a footprint and little nail holes where the nails not even went through, but you could see the nail marks. I'd gone 70 miles over ice and dirt without any holes in them, and not to mention bulk. When bunting booties were the rage, they can take up a giant stuff sack in the sled and in their dog food drop and so forth. So I was looking for something that was much more compact, way more durable, and I currently use booties with a similar fabric. I believe it's nylon. I don't know if they're too high-tech. In fact, it's got simpler and simpler, and that's what I want. I have one booty size. The fabric is light enough that if it's bigger than the dog's foot, it folds over itself nicely without creating any bulk. And I'm using Rob Jacobson's Husky Express booties. I believe it's a nylon fabric with 3/4 inch elastic Velcro. And so I don't want anything fancy. I can remember having booties in 3 different sizes, and this is really a challenge. It's got way simpler to have a booty that fits all the dogs and isn't too big on little dogs and fits big dogs. And so they've done the research. I tested them to my satisfaction, and when I can get 50 miles out of a boot, I'm happy enough with it. And the main reason is, in 50 miles, you're probably going to be stopping, and you're never going to put the same boot on again. In that race, I'll send those boots home, use them the entire next year in training, and start the race with new boots.
Jeff, are you doing or Jacques, are you doing anything different with boots?
Well, when I was running long-distance races, I was using boots by the thousands every year. Then I've been doing mostly mid-distance. In some races, I was using hundreds of booties, and last year I did mostly a sprint season, and I used about 10 booties. So I have to admit, in the last, recently I've not been up to date to what's been done in booties, but, I use some whenever I feel it's needed.
Jeff, what type of fabric? Presumably this is a stretch fabric if it does a small
It's not
foot and a big
it is
fit.
not a stretch fabric. I believe it is a nylon.
Huh.
I honestly don't know the name of the fabric. I don't care. They found it. It's their idea.
Mm-hmm.
Let them make booties. But I don't know the name of it. I think it's, but I believe it's a nylon product.
Mm-hmm. I think, it's something that's interesting. Clearly, it's of compelling interest to a long-distance team, but it's of more than casual interest to a sprint team. I think a lot of sprint mushers in the past have not bootied their dogs because they were so worried that they'd cause an injury because of that loss of traction. And yet, if you had a booty that provided good traction, there's a lot of days when, if you have a dog that has feet that are a little bit sensitive, maybe not quite so tough in the cold, if you could feel assured that they wouldn't hurt themselves, you would boot them.
Right.
Let's see, I had a couple of questions here. We're going to run out of time, and that's probably inevitable in any panel like this. People did have one question. We were talking about this collared neck harness, and they wanted to know, do you think there's a problem with this collar being tight enough it would cut off any kind of circulation, cause problems with especially thick-coated dogs?
I think it's going to need to be sized appropriately, but I can tell you I used those harnesses from Anchorage to Nome, and I didn't have any trouble with breathing. I know it was of concern. Certainly mine also. It definitely fits kind of unusually tight than I was accustomed to, but I most certainly don't think there's any problem, or I wouldn't have been using it.
Well, and I think I would interject, it's tight by comparison to what you're used to. It's in no way tight in the sense of choking a dog or having any kind of a problem there. It's simply not sloppy loose going on and off over the head and the ears, and you have to be a little more careful putting it on and taking it off. But it's not, if it's properly fit, there's absolutely no concern there. Since we are going to run out of time, I'm going to have to be a little bit selective here on what subjects we do and don't cover, and maybe I'm going to turn to you two. We've got about 20 minutes left. What do you have that we haven't covered that you'd like to make absolutely sure we do talk about?
I'd like to share those slides with you on the carousel, and I'd like to discuss dehydrated foods. I think that the day is coming, and I don't think we're there yet, but the day is coming when I just think it's ludicrous to be shipping thousands and thousands and thousands of fresh meat from the lower 48. I can't believe there isn't a better way to do it, and I'm personally anxious and seeing all kinds of potential moves in that direction, and I'm pursuing the technology that will let us have these meats without refrigeration and without the weight incurred by the 85% water that we keep shipping up from
The lower
Michigan.
48 at X cents a pound. That's right. Jock, something you want to make sure we don't miss before we go on to the slides?
Well, I don't know if it's included in the slides, but I think the dog coats is an important topic, especially for the dogs' sake, because we have seen some dogs frostbitten, everybody did, and I think there are some people that are trying to improve this field, and I feel it's pretty important for the dogs' comfort.
What kind of materials are being used in dog blankets or belly protectors these days? Is polar fleece the state of the art, or are there new and better fabrics?
I think polar fleece is obsolete myself.
That's why you're up here.
Polar fleece is obsolete. It does not block the wind, absorbs moisture.
What do you use,
It's
Jeff?
a wonderful. Well, I have used, depending on the specific type of coat, I've used a wind Gore-Tex laminated fleece that is completely windproof. I think that's one of the number one things in a warming coat that we need is to protection from the wind. And then I had the opportunity to experiment with these full body coats last year, ideally just prior to the Copper Basin race, which ultimately was canceled due to cold weather. Had an opportunity to try many and be involved in many of the designs here. Of course, the goal and the problem with previous coats had been that dogs didn't give full protection to the groin on a male or a female, and if it did, then it had a high potential for collecting urine or dog crap and making it quickly obsolete. And for us, it being able to deal with urine, it's very important that it fit exactly right with the dog's physique or is endowed differently than his brother. The placement of the hole is going to be very, very important so that the dog can urinate. But when they fit right, I felt it was something I wanted to pursue more and more. Then I think cooling coats are something we're seeing more and more often. I did use a cooling coat, a coat intended to provide shade and protection from the sun in the beginning of the Iditarod. It's my feeling that in a long-distance race, I hope I don't often need them, that I would want to schedule my run-rest schedule around the hot parts of the day. It just makes sense to rest when it's warm and run when it's hot. So I think they would be not commonly used, but I think there's a lot of things that can be done in times, if you have specific dogs, especially possibly black dogs, having some kind of reflective coat. I've seen everything as simple as a white kerchief, sheets, looks like a kid's Halloween ghost costume that for the dog that reflects the sun. So I think definitely saw some places for them to work. The ones I used at the beginning of Iditarod were pretty hybrid, reflective silver fabric. I think they worked, but I think they're bulky, and it's not something I want to carry in the race. They did their job, but I have not yet felt that they fit into the whole picture of a long-distance race yet. I haven't figured out how to make them work.
Okay, Jeff, how about let's do your slides now.
Okay. Training dogs is certainly what I want to spend most of my time doing, and yet the bigger the dog yard, depending on manpower, the more difficult it can be to do exactly what you want to do. We train dogs obviously on a four-wheeler like this. Next slide, please. We've used motorcycle frames with varied success. Next slide. And the work ethic of the dogs is so high, especially in the fall when we start this kind of fall train before snow, that the potential for overheating seemed higher, and I really wanted to exercise them without making them pull. Next slide, please. And had the opportunity to purchase a couple of these carousels. The constraints of my own dog yard are such that I didn't want to dedicate space to dog walkers for exercise and displace houses and places for dogs to live. These carousels, if you haven't seen one, have their houses mounted on them. They have an access. The center access is off of a semi-tractor trailer, and I have yet to have any failure to that. And as you see, there's a cable on the top of these. The other big advantage in the carousels I've found so far, and even if they never spin, a worthy satisfaction from the whole thing is that I can raise the whole thing as the snow depth accumulate, keeping the snow or the houses the same distance above the supporting ground all year long. So the entire length there, that 5-foot silver square stock you see in the middle, is room I have to move the whole carousel up. If we get that much snow, I can be that high and still keep my dog houses out of the snow. Next slide. Obviously, we have room for 24 dogs on these carousels. We have a dog yard of almost 90. There's 50 some working adults, and most of them enjoy the carousel. Out of the 90-some dogs, I think we have less than 10% that just don't seem to enjoy it on there. That leaves 90 or some 80 that do. And they need to be geared. There's definitely some challenges have been with it. It's not something you turn and walk away from. Next slide. Because when the brakes are released, the dogs will start running. In fact, my dog's now accustomed to this, can see me even walk into the room where the brakes are kept on the other side of the dog yard. There's air brake lines under the ground. You release the brakes, the dogs will start pulling. Depending on who pulls which direction, it will go either way. There's nothing powering this thing or adjusting the speed except the enthusiasm of the dogs. Next slide. Rusty Hagen, who designed this thing and built it, I think says his dogs left unattended after growing up on it put on close to 25 to 30 miles a day. Now, it's way more than I want my dogs to be running, but I think it's interesting to see how far the dogs will go when left to their own devices. We were running, most this summer, dogs would run 4 or 5 days a week at around an hour. When it got too warm, we turn a sprinkler on and sprinkle the whole yard while they're running. But what I find interesting is they love to run, but their work ethic isn't, they're not in harness, they're not in front of a sled, and so they're not busting their butt like they would be if I put the same dog in a harness in front of the four-wheeler. So they're not working so hard, but they're getting this free running exercise. Next slide. It's a lot of fun to ride around on, too. And the dog yard's real easy to pick up. The dogs all seem to go to the outside of the parameter to poop. I don't know why they figured that out. The other thing, we have the same length of chain as designed or suggested in Pride's handbook, but with the house not being in the way, the dog actually has more room to run than he would if the house was on the ground, because he has the entire underneath of his house to run. I think that might be it. Is there one more, Lloyd? No. My goal is to have the dogs run without pulling on that chain at all. It takes very little energy to spin the carousel. My youngest daughter, when the brakes are released, could go out and push it by herself, and yet the whole thing weighs a tremendous amount. Once it gets going, it's very difficult. I have had 2 dogs injured in the last year on the carousel, and both times I, as always, would fault myself for having misguided which dogs are with who. You got to be sure that all the dogs want to go the same speed, and it doesn't take real long to figure out. But it's not something, and I do know of a dog on a dog walker that was killed in Norway some 10 years ago. But the good dramatically outweighs the bad, but it requires supervision, and the dogs love it, and I think that's all that really counts.
Thanks. That's interesting. And I guess, Jeff, maybe your last comments and your comment about the amount of power it takes to pull answered my question. Is here we worry about harness design and then we have dogs pulling from their collars, but what you're telling us is it really takes virtually nothing to pull this and keep it in motion. Okay, I've got a couple of questions up here, and then we're going to have to give this over to Pride. One of our questions is, what should we look for in a lower tech sled for a recreational team that wants to do camping trips? And he says, P.S., we just can't afford nuclear-powered titanium gold-covered sleds. So when you get back to basics, what really is most important?
Well, I'd have to say durability. And if you were starting and going to build your own sled, I wouldn't be scared. I would encourage you to buy a set of those runners and start from there. From there on up and go to the couple of hockey games and have a car full of hockey sticks. You know, it's, I think it is about there's nothing I'd recommend more. All the time and energy that goes into building a sled. I have broke so many sleds, so many runner tails in particular, and when a runner breaks, your entire sled is disabled. All very, very difficult to fix. To me, I just wouldn't start anywhere else, regardless of what I was doing.
So you'd say put your money into your runners and then do what you can do on the top.
Just go with plywood and anything else
and
from there
hockey
up.
sticks. Anything to add, Jacques? Or
Well, for sleds, I think if people are concerned with the price, probably at least 50 or 70% of the price of the sled is the labor. So if you build it yourself, I think you're way ahead of the money.
Okay, we had another question. Would it be better to use polar fleece harnesses in training and foam in races for long distancing to reduce the injury during training, i.e. have more padding provided by the fleece collars and then switch to the ultralights when you race?
Doesn't strike me as a money-saving idea, but makes a lot of sense.
Okay, what's the reason behind attaching a gang line to the nose piece?
Well, I think quite a bit. For me, the steering of the sled dramatically changed from the time I started connecting my gang line to the nose of the sled. I think difficult for me to explain until you try it. What I was trying mostly to do was get the bridle up and out of the way so that it didn't have the potential to hook onto anything. So by connecting and having my bridle on top of my nose piece and coming out a hole in the front of the nose piece, which appears to have it be connected to the nose piece, it keeps the bridle up and out of the ground. It has no potential to catch a stump. There's just less potential for problem. But the sled dramatically handles differently when the sled is attached to the nose piece. It only will work if you have a nose piece suitable for holding on to it. I think that's the only reason I did. It's definitely going to handle way different.
But now for clarification, you're not tying your tow line to the nose piece, you're guiding it either through a hole or through a loop attached to the nose piece. I think that's a critical difference.
Yeah, my tow line there off the bridle is attached to pretty traditional points on top of each runner. It actually is laced through the aluminum runner, and just a simple knot is tied on the opposite side, and then it comes on top of the plastic and through a hole, and it's guided through the nose and looped through the nose, but it's not attached specifically only to the nose.
Okay. I think we're going to have to quit there. The Pride meeting is coming up here immediately following this, and all the people coming to the Pride meeting have to have time to get themselves fed and or their dogs fed before they come back to the auction tonight. Let's give thanks to Jacques and Jeff for sharing their ideas with us. And I would encourage all of you, 7 o'clock tonight at the Fox Roadhouse is the ADMA auction. There's a couple of nice puppies on the auction, some stud fees with the top kennels anywhere. There's Steger mucklucks, there's a fox fur hat, there's birch bowls from the bowl company, there's jerky, dog food, harnesses, just about anything you'd want. It's 7 o'clock at the Fox Roadhouse.